Today, we're going to dive deep into the crisis in Iran, but we're going to look past the day-to-day headlines. We're going to unpack the core strategy of a regime that knows its own people want it gone and what it's willing to do to survive. And believe me, it all starts with a truly startling admission.
It really all comes down to this one chilling quote from Iran's own parliament speaker. He said it out loud: the regime's only path to survival is a bigger war, a war in the Persian Gulf. You have to let that sink in, because that one sentence frames absolutely everything else we're about to talk about.
And let's be absolutely crystal clear about this. That statement, it's not a projection of strength. It's not some tough guy threat. It's a confession. A confession that the leadership knows it has lost the support of its own people and believes its only move left on the chessboard is to start a huge external conflict to distract from its own collapse.
Okay, so first up, let's really examine the regime's own words, these open confessions that reveal just how desperate their situation has become. And it wasn't a one-off comment. The Iranian president doubled down on this, threatening an all-out war just to protect the supreme leader. Again, this is not the language of a confident government. It's the sound of a cornered animal, lashing out because it's terrified of what's happening on the inside.
And that brings us directly to the regime's first and, frankly, its most brutal war, the one it's waging against its own citizens. Now, according to reports smuggled out by doctors on the ground, people risking their lives to get this info out, the number of protesters killed by the regime is over 16,500. And if that wasn't already hard enough to wrap your head around, look at this. The number of injured, over 300,000. The sheer scale of it is almost impossible to comprehend.
But here's the part that is truly staggering. This didn't happen over months or years. This happened in just a few days. To put that into perspective for you, it took Russia almost 2 years of full-scale war in Ukraine to reach similar casualty numbers. The Iranian regime did this to its own people in a fraction of that time. And you have to understand, this wasn't chaos. This was a calculated, cold-blooded strategy. We know the architect was Ali Larijani, the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, and he basically ripped a page straight out of China's 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre playbook. And this is the playbook. It's as simple as it is brutal. It's a 3-step plan. First, you kill dissidents with overwhelming force. Second, you use that very public brutality to terrorize the rest of the population into silence. And third, once you've crushed dissent, you open up the economy just enough to release a little bit of pressure and hold on to power. The regime can't even keep its own lies straight. It would be comical if it weren't so tragic. You had the foreign minister on American television claiming, only hundreds of people died. At the same time, the supreme leader himself was on state TV admitting that, quote, several thousand people had been murdered. I mean, their own words expose them. So this is the critical connection we have to make. How does this internal brutality link up with the external threats? Well, the warmongering is a calculated gamble. It's a desperate attempt to divert everyone's attention, the world's and their own people's, away from the massacre happening at home. And look, this isn't just my analysis. As retired U.S. General David Petraeus puts it, when a regime responds with mass killings, does that signal confidence or fear? The answer is pretty obvious, isn't it? It signals a profound existential fear that the regime feels it's on the brink of collapse.
Okay, so let's shift gears and look at the international response. Because while this massacre was happening, a really complex geopolitical chess match was playing out, and it all led to a very calculated pause from the West.
This is really the key question, right? The White House had been publicly signaling that help was on the way for the Iranian people, and then, suddenly, they hit the brakes. So what happened?
Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a combination of 4 critical factors. First, the U.S. military itself had doubts that strikes would even be effective, since the security forces were so spread out. Second, you had Israel advising them to wait, to hold off for a better opportunity. Third, Iran was actively blackmailing Gulf states, threatening attacks if they didn't lobby the U.S. to stand down. And finally, get this, Iran's foreign minister sent a text message offering to negotiate on its nuclear program if the strikes were called off.
But despite that international pause and the absolutely brutal crackdown, this story is not over, not by a long shot. Because back inside Iran, the resistance has proven to be, well, unbreakable.
I mean, think about this. The regime imposes a total internet blackout across the country. And still, the opposition found a way. Hackers took over state television, broadcasting this message on multiple channels. The Islamic regime is collapsing. Woman, life, freedom. It just goes to show you, even in digital darkness, the resistance is alive and it is fighting. And this gets to a historical parallel that absolutely terrifies the regime, the 1979 protest cycle. This is the exact pattern that brought down the Shah. Protests lead to killings, which lead to mass funerals. Those funerals then become new, even larger protests, creating this unstoppable feedback loop of resistance. The regime is desperately trying to break the cycle, demanding money for bodies, banning public funerals. But you can't bury 16,000 people in secret.
And this right here just perfectly illustrates the ultimate hypocrisy at the heart of the regime. While they're out in public leading chants of death to America, they're sending their own children to live and study in the West. The daughter of Ali Larijani, the man who designed the Tiananmen-style crackdown, she lives in the United States. They don't believe their own propaganda, they just use it to control everyone else.
So the ultimate takeaway is this. A regime that has to declare war on its own citizens to survive is fundamentally unsustainable. Its own actions prove it has no legitimacy left. The only real question here isn't if it will fall, but when.
So what is really going on in Iran? The situation has been escalating like crazy, with massive protests, a near-total internet blackout, and a brutal response from the state. Today, we're going to go way beyond the headlines to give you a deep dive analysis of this crisis, looking at the strategy, the history, and the global chess game that's being played out.
Here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the shocking scale of the government's crackdown. Then, we'll dig into the regime's high-stakes gamble for survival. After that, we'll zoom out to the geopolitical chessboard to see how the world is responding. And finally, we'll try to figure out what on earth could happen next.
Okay, first things first. To understand any of this, we have to get a clear picture of what's happening on the ground. And believe me, the scale of the state's response is a huge piece of this puzzle.
A new report coming from doctors inside Iran reveals a number that is just staggering. Over 16,500 people killed. Let that sink in. We're talking about a level of violence inflicted on its own people in just a matter of days that is almost unheard of. This wasn't chaos. This was a deliberate strategy.
And if that wasn't horrifying enough, the number of injured is estimated to be over 300,000. Medical staff are also reporting something really specific. A lot of people are being shot with pellets in the eyes. This isn't accidental. It's a targeted tactic meant to maim, to terrify, and to intimidate.
And this quote, it just tells you everything about the climate of fear. The regime's strategy is twofold. First, they inflict the physical harm. But then, they make people too terrified to even go to a hospital for help because they know they could be arrested right there. It turns every injury into an even bigger nightmare. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The regime can't even get its own story straight. You've got the foreign minister on U.S. television saying only hundreds of people died, while at home, the supreme leader is admitting to several thousand. When they can't even align their own lies, it tells you there's chaos and conflict right at the top.
So this brings us to the most important question. Why? Why this level of extreme force? Well, this isn't what strength looks like. This is what desperation looks like. This is a high-stakes gamble from a regime that thinks its very survival is on the line.
I mean, listen to this. This is an absolutely stunning admission from Iran's parliament speaker. He's basically saying it out loud. Some of the top leaders believe that starting a bigger external war is their only way to survive, to distract from the chaos at home, and maybe rally people to their side.
So where did they get this idea? It seems the architect of the crackdown, a man named Ali Larijani, is literally copying the playbook from China's Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. It's a grim three-step plan. First, a swift and brutal crackdown to crush dissent. Second, terrorize everyone else into silence. And third, offer just enough economic relief to keep people from rising up again.
And this right here shows the massive hypocrisy at the heart of the regime. Leaders are in the streets chanting death to America, but where are their own children? Living safely in the West. Larijani's own daughter is in the United States on a visa. It's no wonder activists are now demanding that people like her be sent home.
You know, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. And the regime is terrified because the current cycle looks eerily similar to the one that brought down the Shah back in 1979. It started with protests. The state killed people, and then the funerals for the dead became the spark for even bigger protests. That exact pattern is what the leadership is desperate to stop from happening again.
And they're going to extraordinary lengths to break that cycle. Reports say they're actually charging families money just to get the bodies of their loved ones back. And then they're forcing them to sign contracts promising they won't hold a public funeral. It's a direct and frankly ghoulish attempt to snuff out the next potential spark of revolution.
Okay, let's zoom out now. How is this internal crisis playing out on the world stage? For a moment there, it really looked like the US might launch military strikes, but the situation turned out to be way more complicated than that.
So while President Trump was voicing its strong support for the protesters, the decision to hold off on military action came from a bunch of different directions. The US military itself wasn't sure strikes would even work. Allies like Israel were saying, hey, let's wait. Gulf countries were getting pressured by Iran and lobbied for a pause. And then, at the last minute, Iran's foreign minister sends a text offering to talk about the nuclear program.
And it wasn't just complicated externally. Inside the White House, there was a huge debate going on. On one side, you reportedly had figures like Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio pushing for strikes. But on the other, people like Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Treasury Secretary Scott Bassent were arguing to stick with economic pressure instead.
But, and this is a huge but, don't mistake this pause for de-escalation. The U.S. is moving major military hardware into the region, including the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group. This is all about keeping the military pressure on, and all options on the table.
So this all brings us to the final and most critical question of all. Where does Iran go from here? What are the possible outcomes of this crisis? When someone like General David Petraeus weighs in, you tend to listen. And his assessment is stark. He says the regime's current strategy just isn't sustainable in the long run. In fact, he believes the regime is more threatened right now than at any point since the Iran-Iraq war. That's a huge statement about its long-term stability.
And even with the internet shut down and this brutal crackdown in full swing, the resistance is still finding ways to fight back. In this really incredible moment, hackers managed to break into state TV channels. They flashed messages saying the Islamic regime is collapsing and broadcast a call from the former Shah's son for security forces to switch sides. It proves that the regime's control is not absolute.
And that leaves us with the central tension of this whole crisis. Are we watching a regime brutally but effectively crush all opposition and consolidate its power? Or have these very actions pushed it past a tipping point, putting it on a path toward collapse? Right now, nobody knows for sure.